The Complete Tales and Poems of Edgar Allan Poe. Introduction. Edgar Poe was born in Boston, January 19, 1809. His parents, David Poe, Jr., and Elizabeth Arnold Poe, were members of the stock company at the Boston Theatre. There was, however, nothing of New England in his ancestry. His father was the son of David Poe, born in Ireland, who had served as deputy quartermaster general in Baltimore during the Revolution. David Poe, Jr. was born in Baltimore, July 18, 1784, and made his debut on the stage of the Charleston Theatre in 1803. He was a handsome, erratic, and irascible young man who probably drank too much and was only a fair actor. Elizabeth Arnold, on the other hand, has left a tradition of charm and unremitting industry. Coming from England in 1796 with her mother, an actress of some ability, Elizabeth Arnold spent her life in the American theatre at a time when that profession was still under the shadow of the disapproval of the respectable element in society, especially in New England, where she began her career. She became a popular figure from Boston to Charleston, and after her first husband, Charles Hopkins, died in 1805, she married David Poe, Jr. They had three children: William Henry, Edgar, and Rosalie, all born under unfavorable circumstances attending the life of actors of that period. When Elizabeth Poe died in Richmond in 1811, she had separated from her husband, whose known history ends in New York City in 1809. She had made a brave struggle to care for her three little children, and to her son Edgar she left a heritage of courage, dramatic ability, and personal charm. William Henry was taken by his grandparents in Baltimore, while two young matrons of Richmond, Mrs. John Allen and Mrs. William Mackenzie, assumed charge of Edgar and Rosalie. This adoption of Edgar Poe by Mrs. John Allen, who, childless herself, had been attracted by the little boy, colored his entire life. John Allen was a prosperous Scottish merchant, well established in Richmond. Edgar was brought up in comfortable surroundings, was sent to good schools, and though not legally adopted, was regarded generally in Richmond as the son of the house. When Allen's business took them to England in 1815, Edgar saw Scotland, where Allen's people lived, and after a brief visit there, spent 5 years in England, where he was sent to two schools, the first being kept by the Misses Dubourg, whose name appears in The Murders in the Rue Morgue. The second, the Manor House School, presided over by Dr. John Bransby, is pictured vividly in William Wilson. Here he was taught Latin, French, history, and literature, and was known as Edgar Allan. Financial reverses forced Allen's return to Richmond in 1820, but he continued to send Edgar Poe to school. Years later, the headmaster, Joseph H. Clark, testified that his pupil was not conspicuously studious, but always stood well in his class, was, quote unquote, remarkable for self respect, and had, quote, imaginative powers, end quote, of a high order. Poe studied Horace, Cicero, and Homer at Clark's school and continued classical and mathematical studies at the Academy of William Burke, which he entered in 1823. In his school days in Richmond, he seems to have suffered from the fact that his parents had been actors. But his athletic successes, especially in swimming, won him some local fame. Through one of his school friends, Robert Stannard, he met Mrs. Jane Craig Stannard, a young matron whose kindness to Poe made her his first ideal passion. For her, he wrote the first to Helen, one of his finest lyrics. John Allen, through the death of his uncle, became in 1825 a comparatively rich man. He seems to, however, have begun to lose interest in Edgar Poe. He certainly interfered with Poe's first love episode, his engagement to Sarah Elmira Royster, in which opposition he was joined by her father. It is not necessary to take this love story too seriously. It was a boy and girl affair. But together with other reasons to be given later, it may have caused Allen to send Poe to the University of Virginia at Charlottesville to keep him away from Richmond. When Poe registered at the university in February 1826, College was beginning its second year. Founded by Thomas Jefferson on the model of a German university, it provided little guidance or discipline. But the instruction in the schools of ancient and modern languages which Poe entered was of high quality. John Allen provided him at his entrance with only $110 to pay the annual charges of $350, and Poe fell into debt at once for board and other necessary expenses. In consequence, he gambled and unfortunately lost about $2,000, which John Allen declined to pay. Allen also refused to settle Poe's legitimate expenses for clothing. At the end of the term, in December 1826, Poe's formal education was ended. He had taken honors in Latin and French, had studied Italian and Spanish, and had read some history, including Marshall's Life of Washington. He had learned to drink more than was good for him, however, and he had been a witness of brutal fights among the students, and had been part of a life that was unrestrained and at times dissipated. Yet the faculty minutes, which are filled with cases of discipline, do not contain his name as an offender. On Poe's return to Richmond, the differences between him and Allen became acute. Perhaps Allen's infidelities became known to Poe, who would naturally resent them on Mrs. Allen's behalf. Perhaps his slurs upon the Poe family, to which Edgar Poe refers later in a letter from West Point, were the cause. In any event, Poe ran away to Boston in March 1827. He was now upon his own resources, untrained for any occupation, and with a deep sense of resentment against the man who had cast him off. In Boston, he persuaded an obscure printer to issue a volume of poems, Tamerlane and Other Poems, by a Bostonian, which brought him no money and attracted no critical attention, but which brings now about $15,000 as a collector's item. Desperate, apparently, he enlisted in the United States Army as a private soldier on March 26, 1827, giving his name as Edgar A. Perry. Poe was first assigned to Battery H of the 1st Artillery at Fort Independence, Boston Harbor, and was transferred in November to Fort Moultrie on Sullivan's Island in Charleston Harbor. In December 1828, his battery was sent to Fortress Monroe in Virginia. Poe never included his army experience in his autobiographical accounts, evidently being ashamed of his enlistment, but he filled up the 2 years with accounts of a fictitious European trip. Yet his record in the army was a good one. He rose to the rank of a sergeant major, and when after considerable delay Allen agreed to recommend his release, Poe carried with him several testimonials from the officers of the regiment as to his ability and his sobriety. Mrs. Allen died on February 28, 1829, and Poe obtained a furlough, too late to see her alive, but in time to attend her funeral in Richmond. Some reconciliation took place, for Allen joined in seconding Poe's application of admission to West Point. While waiting for his appointment as a cadet, Poe lived mainly in Baltimore, learning to know his grandmother, his aunt, Mrs. Clem, his brother Henry, and his little cousin Virginia. His principal efforts were spent in obtaining a publisher for a second volume of verse, Al-Araf, Tamerlane and Minor Poems, which appeared in Baltimore in December 1829. The poems in this volume received some favorable notice in advance of publication in John Neal's Yankee. In Boston, and a letter from Poe that Neal included in his review shows that he was conscious that, in spite of discouragements, poetry was the main purpose of his life. Allen refused to help him in the publication of Al-Araf, but occasionally sent him some money. Unfortunately, Poe still owed Sergeant Graves, who had acted as his substitute in the military formalities attendant upon his release from the army, and he wrote to Graves in May 1830, telling him he could not obtain the money, since Mr. A is not very often sober. Graves sent this letter to John Allen, and the consequences can be imagined. According to John Allen's will, 2 illegitimate sons were born to him on July 1830, and he was courting his second wife, whom he married in October 1830. The boy he had brought up as one of his family became therefore more and more a liability to him, which he was not anxious to discharge. Poe took the entrance examinations for West Point in June 1830 and entered upon his duties as a cadet in July. His stay was brief, however, and it's difficult to see why he entered the military academy, for he must have known the discipline would be strict and the drill of repetition of his army training. A long letter that he sent to Allen on January 3rd, 1831, written evidently in reply to one upbraiding him for the Graves episode, reviews their entire relationship and states that Allen had refused the allowance that cadets usually were given by their relatives. Unable to resign Without Allen's consent, Poe deliberately provoked his dismissal from the Academy by neglecting his duties and breaking the rules. Leaving the Point in February 1831, he went to New York City, where he secured the publication of the Poems of 1831, containing first drafts of some of his greatest poems like To Helen, Israfel, and The City in the Sea. Poe had secured subscriptions from some of his comrades at West Point. How Poe lived during the next 2 years is a mystery. Joining the household of Mrs. Clem in Baltimore, he made an unsuccessful effort to obtain a position as a teacher, and his letters to Allen speak of the utmost poverty. He was not idle, however, for when a prize was offered by the Philadelphia Saturday Courier in June 1831, he submitted 5 stories, none of which won the prize. They were printed anonymously, however, in the Courier during 1832, but it is doubtful if he received any payment for them. He went through the harrowing experience of offering his stories to magazines and having them rejected, and after a long silence, he appealed in April 1833 to Allen in a letter that is truly a cry from the depths. He concluded it: "Without friends, without any means, consequently, of obtaining employment, I am perishing, absolutely perishing for want of aid. And yet I am not idle, nor addicted to any vice, nor have I committed any offense against society which would render me deserving of so hard a fate. For God's sake, pity me and save me from destruction." It was his last appeal to John Allen, who died on March 27, 1834, not mentioning Poe in his will. A ray of good fortune came, however, in 1833. Poe won a prize of $50, obtained by the Baltimore Saturday Visitor on a short story contest with "The Manuscript Found in a Bottle." One of the judges, John Pendleton Kennedy, a lawyer and a novelist, helped Poe financially, aided him in placing his stories, and secured for him the position of editor of the Southern Literary Messenger in Richmond. Poe began his editorial connection with the Messenger in the summer of 1835, and as soon as he could arrange for a residence, brought Mrs. Clem and Virginia to Richmond in October. His letter to them, written on August 29, reveals how passionately he loved his young cousin and how desperately lonely he was without her. A marriage license was issued on September 22, but notwithstanding all that has been written about a quote-unquote secret marriage, no actual ceremony took place until May 16, 1836. Notwithstanding the attitude of T.H. White, the proprietor of the Messenger, who did not announce Poe's editorship until October, the magazine soon felt the effect of his skillful management. His reviews soon established the paper as the leading critical journal in the South, and his stories attracted national attention. While Poe was not our first critic, he was our first great critic. He was independent both of the British criticism and of the publishing connections in this country, and his keen analysis relentlessly held up to ridicule the pretentious and the absurd. He was quick, however, to recognize new talent, and such reviews as those on the poetry of Joseph Rodman Drake and Fitz Greene Halleck were the occasion of a discussion of the nature of poetry which is still valid. Poe built up the circulation of the Messenger from 500 to 3,500 copies, but in January 1836 he ceased to be editor. Some time later, he gave the reason that, quote, "the drudgery was excessive, the salary contemptible," unquote. His salary was $10 weekly, but there were apparently extra payments, and it was probably his desire to work in a larger field that took him in February 1837 to New York. His usual ill luck brought this venture into the hard times of 1837. He completed his narrative of Arthur Gordon Pym, but publication was postponed by Harper's until 1838. So realistic were the descriptions of the voyage to the Antarctic Ocean, that it was treated in England as a true story. Yet the best portion of the tale begins when Poe trusts to his own imagination for the terrors of the savages' attack and the destruction of Pym's canoe by the mysterious figure, whiter than snow. Disappointed in New York, he began in 1838 his most productive period in Philadelphia. He was attracted by its preeminence at that time as a publishing center. Here he published his conchologist's first book, a piece of hackwork in which his knowledge of shells was reflected. One of his greatest short stories, Ligeia, and one of his most striking poems, The Haunted Palace, appeared in 1838. And in January 1839, he became associated with William E. Burton in the editing of the Gentleman's Magazine. Burton was an actor and manager who needed assistance in the conduct of the periodical, and Poe also contributed short stories and verse among the former The Fall of the House of Usher. He fell out with Burton, however, and in June 1840 gave up his position partly because of his great desire to have a journal of his own, to be called the Pen magazine. This was to be of higher grade than Burton's or Godey's, the popular magazines of the day. His other great desire was achieved in the publication, late in 1839, of his Tales of the Grotesque and the Arabesque, his first volume of short stories, 25 in number. He received from Lee and Blanchard, the publishers, the copyright and 20 copies of the book, but no financial return. Poe believed that this publication would help him in selling his stories to periodicals, for his support depended entirely upon them. His anxiety about Virginia led him to move in 1839 or 1840 to a house near Fairmount Park, and for a time the fresh air resulted in some improvement in her health. His constant struggle to make a living made him welcome an offer from George R. Graham, who had purchased Burton's magazine and combined it with the casket under the name of Graham's Magazine. Poe and Graham made it the leading periodical of its kind in the United States by the policy, which apparently no one had yet discovered, of paying good prices to its contributors. They secured in this way the foremost American writers, and before Poe left the editorial chair, the circulation had risen from 5,000 to 35,000 copies. In April 1841, Poe published in Graham's The Murders in the Rue Morgue, the first of his stories of ratiocination, as he called them, or in the popular phrase, detective stories. His central character, Monsieur Dupin, solved his puzzles not by mechanical means, but by reasoning, based upon analysis of the characters and situations, and Poe's detective stories, in consequence, remain unsurpassed today. His talent for analysis resulted also in his challenge to readers of Graham's to send in cryptograms for solution, which he invariably solved. Poe joined Graham partly because he believed the latter would in turn join him in publishing the Pen magazine. Poe, as usual, was ahead of his time. His idea of issuing two magazines, one for the mass of the public and one for a more select audience, has been successfully carried out today. Poe's reviews in Graham's magazine were notable. In his criticism of Longfellow's ballads, he defined poetry as, quote, the rhythmical creation of beauty, end quote. While in his review of Hawthorne's Twice Told Tales, he established a standard definition for the short story that has remained undisturbed through all later discussion of the topic. Poe left Graham's in May 1842 because he still had hopes for the Pen magazine, and because his editorial salary of $800 was too small, he naturally felt for his services. He was hopeful, too, of obtaining a clerical position in Washington. But here again, he was unlucky. He was a Whig in politics, and his party was in power only twice during his lifetime. His visit to Washington in 1843, when he yielded to the temptation of taking too much drink, ended his hope of political office. To his other anxieties was added the fluctuations in Virginia's health. In January 1842, while singing at her piano in the house at Fairmount, she broke a blood vessel. The constant fear, with recurrent hopes for her recovery, was, as Poe wrote to his young correspondent Eveleth 6 years later, an ever-present torment. But she gave him also the happiness that comes to anyone who devotes himself to a wife, who rewards his self-sacrifice by her own worship. One of the most persistent errors in biographies of Poe lies in the references to Virginia as a permanent, quote-unquote, child wife, although contemporary evidence, when masculine, constantly refers to her grace and her talent, especially in music. In the spring of 1843, the family moved to a cottage on North 7th Street in the district called Spring Garden. It still remains the most comfortable of all their residences now standing, but the specter of want was over it. Poe was without regular employment, and the new magazine venture, The Stylus, for which he had such high hopes, came to nothing. He won $100 for the Gold Bug in a prize contest, and sold stories occasionally to annuals or a magazine, but it needed all Mrs. Clem's economy to keep the family going. He published in 1843 the first of what he hoped would be a series of booklets containing reprints of his tales, but the first number of the prose romances of Edgar A. Poe, consisting of The Murders in the Rue Morgue and The Man That Was Used Up, was also the last. It sold for 12 1/2 cents, and ironically, the Library of Congress has insured one of the very few copies now existing for $50,000. In April 1844, Poe moved to New York City, tempted perhaps by its growing importance. His first publication, The Balloon Hoax, which appeared in the New York Sun of April 13, 1844, described an imaginary trip of a balloon across the Atlantic Ocean in 3 days, so realistically that thousands were deceived. At first, he made some money by letters to the Columbia Spy, describing New York City. Poe was always interested in the localities in which he lived, and he roamed far and wide over this island of Manhattan, just as he had floated down the Wissahickon Creek in Philadelphia before he wrote Morning on the Wissahickon. Poe lived in several houses in New York City, soon taking Virginia out of the neighborhood of the Hudson River near 84th Street, where the air was more bracing than in the city. Notwithstanding his growing fame as a writer of short stories, The Gold Bug having a circulation of 300,000 copies, he still had difficulty in making a living. He prepared a new edition of his Tales of the Grotesque and Arabesque under the title of Fantasy Pieces, carefully revising his texts. But Harper's declined to publish the new edition. Lowell had been asked to write a biography of Poe for Graham magazine, and at his request, Poe sent him a very interesting analysis of his feelings and his work at this time. He rightly chose his new story, The Purloined Letter, as the best of his tales of ratiocination, and his epigram, Man is now only more active, not more happy, no more wise than he was 6,000 years ago. It's still perhaps as valid as it was in 1844. Lowell spoke of Poe in this article as, quote, the most discriminating, philosophical, and fearless critic upon imaginative works who has written in America, unquote. Necessity made him accept a post on the staff of the New York Mirror, edited by Nathaniel Parker Willis. Here, The Raven appeared on January 29, 1845, copied in advance of publication from the February issue of the American Review. This poem probably attracted more attention than any American poem before its day. Its lasting fame is due not only to the magnificent phrasing, but also to the picture of the devotion of a lover, quote, dreaming dreams no mortal ever dared to dream before, unquote. It was begun, undoubtedly, in one of those moments of despair when Virginia's death seemed to be approaching. In March 1845, Poe left the Mirror and became one of the editors of the Broadway Journal, and a sharer in the profits, if there were any. He was working at this time about 14 hours a day, writing and delivering a lecture on the poets and poetry of America. It was not making a living. An edition of his tales appeared in 1845, but it contained only 12 stories. He was to receive a royalty of 8 cents a copy on a book that sold for 50 cents. It was the first and only time he derived any revenue from a volume of his short stories. His best criticisms in the Broadway Journal dealt with the drama and theater, in which he made a plea for more natural acting. Poe was never unsocial, and while the accounts of his attendance at the gatherings of writers at the homes of Anne Lynch and others are usually overstressed, he and sometimes Virginia attended these parties, and he was generous in his response to requests to recite his poetry. Probably most of his guests were women. Poe, at all times, kindled the feminine sympathy. Early in 1845, he met Frances Sargent Osgood, a poetess of some ability, who was to remain the warm friend of both Poe and Virginia, and who, when she was herself dying in 1850, paid a glowing tribute to his character and to his devotion to his wife. Yet their relations were made by some busybodies the occasion of some unpleasant notoriety. The Raven and Other Poems, the last collected editions of his poetry to appear under his own editorial care, was published in November 1845. 30 poems, beginning with The Raven and ending curiously with the first to Helen, make up the volume, which was dedicated to Mrs. Browning. In the preface, Poe said, "Events not to be controlled have prevented me from making at any time any serious effort in what, under happier circumstances, would have been the field of my choice. With me, poetry has been not a purpose, but a passion." In October, Poe had gone to Boston to read an original poem on the invitation of the Boston Lyceum. He could not write occasional poetry, so he read Al-Araf, and unfortunately later in the evening made some remarks about Boston that raised a new crop of enemies for him. In the same month, he obtained complete control of the Broadway Journal. Now at last he had what he had been longing for, a magazine of his own. But despite valiant efforts, he could not keep the journal alive, and it expired in January 1846. He had no capital, and while he was one of the most competent editors of his day, he could not understand that a magazine must lose money at the start. In any event, the Broadway Journal was a weekly, not the monthly of a high type in which he was really interested. Poe was active in criticism during 1846. In April appeared his essay, The Philosophy of Composition, in which he analyzed the process by which he created the raven. Few believe he wrote the poem in this artificial way, but it contains some very interesting general reflections of his poetic creed. In May, he began in Godey's Ladies' Book of Philadelphia a series of articles on the writers in and near New York City entitled The Literati. These great These created a great deal of excitement and led to one libel suit. Poe's judgments were usually accurate, but occasionally he let his talent for satire run away with him, and his criticism of Dr. Thomas Dunn English caused a reply that accused Poe of forgery and of being, quote, an assassin in morals, unquote. English's attack was printed in the Evening Mirror, no longer under Willis's charge, so Poe sued this paper for libel and was awarded damages in the amount of $225. In 1846, Poe secured a home in a small cottage at Fordham, at that time some 13 miles out of the city, near what is now East 192nd Street. In this modest house of one story and an attic, which is now a Poe memorial, Poe watched Virginia slowly fading away. The strain was evidently making even the work necessary to their support very difficult for him, and if it had not been for Willis's appeal for financial help and the friendly efforts of Mrs. Marie Louise Shue, a widow with some medical training, it is hard to see how the family could have survived. Yet Poe kept up a brave struggle, cheered a bit by his growing recognition in France, where his stories were being translated, and by an extended and favorable critique that appeared in the Revue des Deux Mondes. Testimony given later by the friends he made in the faculty of St. John's College at Fordham is definitely against his drinking to excess at this time. Virginia died on January 30, 1847. Poe collapsed after the long strain, and Mrs. Shue's diagnosis was probably correct. She believed that he had a lesion of the brain which made it dangerous to give him stimulants, and yet he needed them to bring him up from the fever caused, as she wrote later, quote, by actual want and hunger and cold, and having been borne by this heroic husband in order to supply food, medicine, and comforts to his dying wife, unquote. What Poe thought of Mrs. Shue is shown in two poems he addressed to her. He gradually returned to health, at least mentally, for one of his finest poems, Ulalume, was published in December 1847, and in 1848 he read his prose poem, Eureka, before the Society Library in New York City. It was Poe's attempt at a solution of the creation and ultimate destiny of the universe, and it was published by Putnam, who made what he considered a generous advance of $14. Eureka has usually been avoided by Poe's critics, but it by no means deserves this neglect. Of course, Poe did not solve the riddle of the universe, but then no one else has done so, and his theories bear, in some respects, sufficient similarity to the more scientific findings of modern astronomical physicists like the late Sir Arthur Eddington, to prove that Poe's mind was in no sense deteriorating, but was capable of clear and consistent thinking upon a difficult subject. After Virginia's death, Poe became involved in several episodes with his women friends that have been either overstressed or misinterpreted. Three of them, however, have attracted so much attention that the correct facts must be given, stripped of the sentimentalities that have clouded them. The second, To Helen, was written for Mrs. Sarah Helen Power Whitman, an attractive widow and poetess of Providence, Rhode Island, whom Poe had seen in 1845, but whom he did not meet until 1848. They became engaged to be married, but the brief engagement was broken by Mrs. Whitman, largely because of the opposition of her mother. There is an artificial note in Poe's many letters to her, yet there was a sincere affection between them. In 1860, Mrs. Whitman published an able defense of Poe's character and a brilliant analysis of his writings under the title of Edgar Poe and His Critics. The courtship of Mrs. Whitman was partly a literary venture, but Poe's devotion to Mrs. Richmond bore more resemblance to a love affair. Mrs. Charles Richmond, Nancy Locke Haywood, whom Poe always called Annie, lived in Lowell, Massachusetts, where Poe met her when he lectured there in June 1848. He loved her passionately and urged her to come and live near him and Mrs. Clem, but she acted with self-respect through the episode and evidently had no intention of leaving her husband. Yet she remained, even after Poe's death, one of his staunchest defenders. Poe describes her in his story of Lander's Cottage. To her, he wrote his poem for Annie. Poe tells in his letters to Annie how one magazine after another was postponing payment to him. He wrote his best critical essay on poetry, The Poetic Principle, late in 1848 as a lecture, taking it with him on his last trip to Richmond. On June 30, 1849, he left New York City, stopping at Philadelphia, where he went to the home of John Sartain, editor of the Union magazine, in a distracted condition, believing he was being pursued. Sartain, C.C. Burr, and George Lippard, the novelist, took care of him, and he left Philadelphia on July 13. In Richmond, he seemed to take on a new lease of life. He lived at the Swan Tavern, a respectable hotel, near the residence of his old friends, the Mackenzies, with whom Rosalie was still living. He renewed his boyhood love affair with Sarah Myra Royster Shelton, now a widow, and lectured with some success on the poetic principle. Poe made a brave effort to avoid drinking, a difficult matter in a hospitable southern city, even joining the Sons of Temperance. He wrote for the Richmond Examiner and was busily engaged in projects for the stylist, his pet illusion. The marriage between Mrs. Shelton and Poe was fixed for October 17, and Poe left Richmond for New York City to bring Mrs. Clem to the wedding. He spent the evening of September 26 with Mrs. Shelton, and after stopping at the office of Dr. John Carter, took supper with some friends and apparently boarded the boat for Baltimore about 4 o'clock in the morning, September 27th, in good condition. From this point on until October 3rd, the events of the last days of Edgar Poe are uncertain. He apparently arrived in Baltimore on the morning of September 28th, tried to call on his friend Dr. N.C. Brooks, but found him out. He was well known in Baltimore, and it seems unlikely that he would have remained unnoticed there for 6 days. The most creditable account, given originally by Thomas H. Lane, who had helped him in the last days of the Broadway Journal, is to the effect that he came to Philadelphia, spent the night at the residence of James P. Moss, a friend of Poe, and left in rather poor condition, probably on September 30, intending to go to New York. Instead, by mistake, he took the train to Baltimore. According to Poe's letter of September 18 to Mrs. Clem, he expected to stop in Philadelphia to call on a poetess whose verses he was to edit, and he asked his aunt to write to him in that city. Disregarding other and less tangible accounts, the next certainty lies in a letter received by his friend Dr. J.E. Snodgrass in Baltimore on October 3 from a printer named Walker, who wrote, "Dear Sir, there is a gentleman rather worse for wear at Ryan's 4th Ward Polls, who goes under the cognomen of Edgar A. Poe, and who appears in great distress, and he says he is acquainted with you, and I assure you he is in need of immediate assistance." Dr. Snodgrass found Poe at Gunner's Hall, a public house, at 44 East Lombard Street, and he and Henry Herring, the husband of Poe's aunt Elizabeth Poe, took him to the Washington College Hospital on the afternoon of October 3rd. He did not regain consciousness sufficiently to tell Dr. Moran, the attending physician, how he arrived at this condition. Poe died at 5 o'clock on Sunday morning, October 7, and was buried on October 9 in the Presbyterian Cemetery at Fayette and Green Streets, in the lot that had belonged to his grandfather, David Poe. In 1875, his coffin was removed to the southeastern corner of the cemetery, where his monument now stands. The mystery so often associated with Poe's life and nature is unjustified. Based in the beginning upon Griswold's memoir, full of falsehoods and half-truths, it has been augmented by conjectures and assumptions of biographers more interested in turning a phrase than in ascertaining facts. He was in reality a hard-working man of letters, whose poems and stories were above the level of the periodicals of his day, upon which he depended for support. His editorial labors, successful as they were ill-paid, and his lack of powerful friends kept him from political office. His volumes of verse or of prose paid him little or nothing, and his fearless and at times ill-natured criticisms made him enemies. Handicapped by Virginia's illness and by an inherited tendency to drink, in which he found temporary relief from his troubles, he made a brave struggle to succeed, and finally succumbed to conditions that he could not overcome. He was human, and when he was attacked, he struck back, not always wisely and in a few cases unfairly. But his work has grown steadily in the estimation of the best critical judgments here and abroad. Without the aid of any cult of admirers who build upon his achievements a reputation for discrimination, without any strong popular appeal to a democratic audience, he has won his position by the power of an imagination and by the beauty of a style that have baffled the many imitators who have tried in vain to reach the shining level where he remains secure. Arthur Hobson Quinn.